Welcome to Marking the End Times. I'm Mark Hitchcock, and as always, it's so great to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking time to watch these videos, and I want to encourage you to tell others if these videos are blessing you. You can subscribe here to endtimes.com, but you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you get notification when these come out each week. And so if you're not a subscriber on the YouTube channel, I'd appreciate it if you do that. And if it's blessing you, that you'd tell others about it as well. On today's program, I want to talk about some recent events in Libya. And these events in Libya, I think, have some really profound implications for the Gog-Magog prophecy in Ezekiel 38. We have a peace, kind of a peace pact. There's kind of momentum for that with the Abrahamic Accords. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, but at the same time, you kind of have that happening. You also have the Gog Coalition building. So you kind of have two things happening, kind of moving on parallel tracks at the same time that I think both are very significant for end time prophecy. So we'll talk about that here in just a moment. In a bit, we'll go to the subscriber only section. And there's a question about Daniel chapter 12 and the timing of the rapture. Does Daniel chapter 12 teach a post-tribulation rapture? We'll talk about that. There's another question about the timing of the two witnesses in Revelation 11 as related to the trumpet judgments, the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. And then another question about the heavenly city, the New Jerusalem, or the Father's house. Is the Father's house, where Jesus promised, the place He's promised He's preparing for us, is that just a temporary place where believers will be during the 7-year tribulation period, or is it much more extensive than that? So we'll talk about the Father's house, what that is, and what's happening there now, and what the future is for that place that Jesus referred to as the Father's house. So we'll look at those questions when we get to the subscriber-only section. But what I want to talk about is the peace process over in Israel, but also some things happening in Libya and other nations that are kind of happening at the same time that point toward the Gog-Magog invasion. Now, we know from past programs we've done here that Israel is trying to build on the historic Abrahamic Accords. We've talked about that extensively. They have, these normalization of relations with Bahrain, with Morocco, with the United Arab Emirates, with Sudan. These agreements were forged during the Trump administration and finalized during that time. And as we talked about a couple weeks ago, Israel is very anxious to expand these and include Saudi Arabia. Now, what's fascinating to me is when you read Ezekiel 38 and you get down to like verse 13 to 16, that whole passage is about this Gog-Magog invasion, the nations that will invade Israel during the end time. But it mentions several nations that will be on the sidelines, they're not going to be involved. It's the young lions of Tarshish, which I take it is the nations in Europe today. And it also mentions Sheba and Dedan, which are these more moderate Arab states that Israel now is getting these normalized relations with. But at the same time that's happening, just this last week, there's some massive protests that erupted in Libya because Libya's foreign minister met with Israel's foreign minister to talk about some idea maybe of normalizing relations. There's kind of beginning talks about maybe having peace. Now, this created a massive uproar in Libya. The nation has been rocked by protests. There's an article in the BBC that says protests erupt in Libya over contact with Israel. Now you say, well, why is that significant? Well, it's interesting. Israel and Libya, at least this one lady there, want to, kind of begin to bring their nations together for peace. But the people there erupted over this, and they've been rocked by these protests because they don't want peace with Israel. And the reason that's significant, Libya is one of the nations mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 38, as joining this coalition of nations with Russia and Iran and Turkey. So let me read this passage. We've read it before, but it's just good to hear God's word and hear these prophecies. Then the word of the Lord came to me. So this is God's word. Son of man, set your face against Gog, the land of Magog. So Gog's the leader of the invasion. The land of Magog is the underbelly of the old Soviet Union. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan. It could include other nations as well, like Afghanistan. It could include, some people believe it could possibly include the Ukraine. But it says he's the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Now, Rosh is Russia, but Meshech and Tubal are modern-day Turkey. And prophesy against him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Notice again, God saying this. This is his word. I'm against you, Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I'll turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out and your whole army, your horses and horsemen fully armed, a great horde with large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. Persia, modern-day Iran, the name was just changed in 1935. Cush, that's the modern nation of Sudan, just to the south of Egypt. And Put, the ancient land of Put was the land to the west of Egypt, which is modern-day Libya. Now, it could include more than that, but it certainly does include at least Libya. It says, we'll be with them, all with shields and helmets. Gomer with all of its troops. Gomer is part of modern-day Turkey. And then it mentions Beth Togarmah from the far north with all its troops. And Beth Togarmah there, the house of Togarmah, is also in the modern-day nation of Turkey. But one of the Gog nations, coalition nations, is the nation of Libya. Now, in this article that I mentioned where it says protests erupt in Libya over contact with Israel, it goes on to say this. Libya's prime minister has suspended his foreign minister after she met with her Israeli counterpart. Libya, a strong backer of the Palestinian cause, does not recognize Israel, and the meeting has sparked protests in the majority Arab state. And so this meeting happened last week in Italy. The Israeli foreign minister and the Libyan foreign minister met just briefly in Italy for a meeting there. And the Israeli foreign minister, Eli Cohen, said the historic meeting was the first step in establishing relations with Libya. It says Israel is working to build closer ties with Arab and Muslim majority countries which do not officially recognize it. And again, we've seen that with the Abrahamic Accords. But it says, however, Libya's presidential council, which represents its 3 provinces, said it was illegal to normalize relations with Israel. The Speaker's office in Parliament accused the Libyan foreign minister of grand treason. And so she's had to flee, this Libyan foreign minister has had to flee the country. Now, what's interesting, where did she flee to? She fled to Turkey. She fled to Turkey, which is another of the nations. In fact, 4 of the nations mentioned in Ezekiel 38, those ancient nations, are in modern-day Turkey. And President Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has pledged after his re-election that he's going to continue to deepen ties with Libya. And Libya's leaders were among the first nations to congratulate Erdogan, the Turkish president, upon his re-election. So she's fled there to Turkey, which again just shows the close connection between these nations. Now, in his statement on Sunday, Mr. Cohen, Eli Cohen, the foreign minister of Israel, said that he met the foreign minister of Libya last week on the sidelines of a summit, and that they discussed the great potential for relations between Israel and Libya. So it was a brief discussion. But when word got out about this in Libya, it says protests broke out in the capital of Tripoli and some other cities following news of the meeting. Roads were blocked, tires were burnt, and demonstrators waved the Palestinian flag, though the protests appear to have been relatively contained. Now, Libya has been a country in chaos since Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's regime was overthrown 12 years ago, back during that time period known as the Arab Spring. And Libya has been a nation that's been really at war, in a civil war between 2 warring parties. But they seem to be united on this idea that they don't want to normalize relations with Israel. In fact, they said this week that it's considered a violation of Libyan laws which criminalize normalization with the Zion entity. So they've criminalized any kind of normalization of relations with Israel. Now, at the same time, you kind of have these things going on in Libya there. Also, one of the other things that's happening is there are a lot of Russian mercenaries in Libya. Remember Yevgeny Prigozhin? He was the head of, remember that Wagner group? We talked about that several weeks ago when he, had that kind of attempted coup that was very short-lived, and then he kind of traveled about for a while. And of course, just this last week, it appears that he was on an airplane that was sabotaged and bombed and so the plane falls out of the sky, and so it seems like now that he's been assassinated, he's been killed. But the Russian army, the Wagner group, they've had troops in Libya since 2019. There are 2,000 mercenaries there today. Now, a fascinating article just came out a few weeks ago in Foreign Policy magazine that said Libya could be Putin's trump card. That Libya could be his trump card. You say, well, how would that be? Well, the Wagner group, who works under the auspices, of course, and the authority of the Russians, has overtaken the oil facilities in Libya. Now, Libya has 40% of Africa's total oil reserves. They have 48 billion barrels of oil of reserves. They have 53 trillion cubic feet of gas. And the Wagner group that's there, supported by Russia, can obstruct output to the EU. So the EU, of course, they're protesting what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and they're trying to get away from Russian oil. And so one of their sources of oil is Libya. But now that the Wagner group has taken this over and can cut off the spigot, they're right there in NATO's NATO's backyard. And this winter, as the winter comes up, that's always the concern in Europe. Where are they going to get enough gas? The winter gas supply could end up being a great crisis. And in this article that says Libya could be Putin's trump card, it says that Wagner and Russia can dial up the pressure on Europe's energy crisis. So they're going to be able to impose a lot of pressure on Europe, especially this winter, if they cut off this gas from Libya. So Libya, it's a country that's been in chaos, and people think, well, what's the significance of this nation? It's one of the 5 main nations mentioned in the Gog Coalition. And here you have an Israeli foreign minister, and the foreign minister of Libya kind of just beginning talks about normalizing relations, and it's blown up immediately. So what we see again, like I said earlier, we kind of have 2 things moving in this Gog-Magog invasion on parallel tracks. It says when the Gog-Magog invasion occurs, Israel has to be at peace and living securely. So we see the whole Abrahamic Accords track with Bahrain and United Arab Emirates and Morocco, Sudan. Of course, they already have peace, Israel does, with Jordan and Egypt. So have all that happening. At the same time, you have the Gog Coalition here building. Now, the one outlier in all of this is the Sudan, because Sudan is mentioned here in Ezekiel 38 as an ally of Russia and Turkey and Iran and Libya. But Sudan is one of the nations that's normalized relations with Israel. But Sudan still is very enmeshed with Russia. They want to give Russia a port on the Red Sea. And so when everything finally shakes out, when the dust settles, Sudan will be a part of this coalition as well. But we just see, here people are in Libya that they don't want any part of the normalization of these relations. And so they're taking their side and aligning with these other nations. So the nations here are shaking out just as we would expect them to be shaking out. And they're forming just as we would expect if these events are imminent and happening soon. So it's something we'll keep our eyes on, is what's happening over there, and give further updates about this. But there's a lot happening very quickly. Now, again, we'll go now to the subscriber-only section, answer these questions about the heavenly city, the New Jerusalem, about the 2 witnesses, and the question about Daniel chapter 12 and the timing of the rapture. If you're not a subscriber and you'd like to be, you can go to endtimes.com, and for just $7 a month, you can have access to all kinds of great information, and you can be a blessing to this ministry as well. So we appreciate your fellowship with us. We'll go now into the subscriber-only section. Now we'll answer these questions.